Well, welcome again, everyone. It's lovely to see you all on this very cold and rainy winter Cambridge day. But at least the church is warm, and so we have coffee and we have food afterwards, so please do stay after for the lunch. If you've signed up for it, and maybe even if you haven't, we still might have enough for all of us. But it's my delight. I introduce myself once again. I'm Mark Scarlatta. I'm the vicar chaplain here at St. Edward's. And one of the things as we continue to talk, and now we're into our third StED talk, and we're very excited to have Dr. Jane Williams with us this afternoon. But one of the things as we keep remembering why we're putting this on or why we're doing this is because we're trying to re-envisage what it means to bring theology out from the heart of the church. A theology that is committed to prayer, to service, to life, all of these great and wonderful things. And to do that, we're having these lunches and these talks during the week, but for some of you who might be working on MAs or PhDs, we also have a group of PhD students who are studying here during the week. So our little St. Edward's scriptorium meets here. We have some study spaces up in the choir loft and downstairs as well when it starts to get a bit too cold out. But if you'd like to learn more about that, please chat with me or even some of the scriptorium folks, Michael and Matthew and Jonathan and Cooper, some of the people that are a part of it are here throughout the week. Please do talk to them because you might want to find a kind of a small community of study and a small learning community where you can participate in prayer, in life, in study, in this place and with this group of people. So, without further ado, I am excited that Dr. Jane Williams is with us. Jane is one of my colleagues and the Associate Dean at St. Mellitus College in London. Jane is also the co-founder, really, of St. Mellitus College. She, along with a fellow called Mike Lloyd, who is the principal at Wycliffe College, and Bishop Graham Tomlin, set out to create something new in the Church of England, a new way of training ordinands. And I've been lucky enough to be her colleague and to participate in that over the past years. But Jane has also been a prolific writer. I didn't know that you've written so much until I went online and discovered all of Jane's books. But Jane has written a book called Perfect Freedom in 2001, Angels. More recently, she's written Why Did Jesus Have to Die? The Art of Advent is a wonderful, if you're looking for an Advent devotional, I highly recommend this. I used it last year. Jane has a small commentary on these beautiful images, and it's really printed well, and it's such a pretty, it's a wonderful way to go through Advent and into Epiphany. And today she'll be speaking to us on her latest book called The Merciful Humility of God. And so we are extremely privileged and extremely grateful for Jane, and so I will invite her up to speak to us this afternoon.
Thank you. Wonderful. Well, I am thinking of employing Mark as my publicist. He's doing well there, isn't he? Am I audible? Yeah, not quite. I will try and speak up. I will try not to cough too loudly at you as well. I am struggling from... Mark and I were away last week with 300-odd students, and students are so full of germs, it's just terrible. So I'm trying not to pass them on too much. Mark says I'm going to talk about my Lent book, The Merciful Humility of God, but I'm not really. I'm going to pick up some of the ideas that book explores. But in particular, I'd love your help in thinking through some of the things that emerged for me, some of the themes that emerged for me as I wrote the book. My great passion is to get people doing Christology and doctrine without noticing that they're doing that. So I try to write theology that sort of gets under the skin, and so that people are thinking the big questions about the nature of God and the nature of Christ and the Holy Spirit's interaction with us in the world and so on, without noticing that what they're doing is actually doctrine. But I thought in this context, maybe you'd be prepared for me to use the D word, the doctrine word, and you can help me do some thinking about some of those themes. In particular, the theme that I want to explore is this question of of God's action in Jesus Christ, which is so counterintuitive, so much not the way in which we, if we were setting about saving the world, would do it. And my sense over the decades in which I've been teaching doctrine is that we resist this glimpse into the reality of God that we see in Jesus Christ over and over and over again. So one of the things that I think we always need to see as a result of doctrine is that the nature of God affects the nature of our discipleship. If this is the God that we worship, then that has implications for the kind of lives that we're trying to live. The powerlessness and, I'm going to be arguing, humility of God that we see in action in Jesus Christ is something that we as individuals and certainly as church have resisted as a necessary corollary of the nature of God for all the centuries that there have been Christians. We've tried, I think, to persuade ourselves that God's humility, as we see it in Jesus Christ, is a facet of God's action in the incarnation, but not a facet of God. That then has major doctrinal implications because it separates the revelation of God in Jesus Christ from the actuality of God. So I'm going to be suggesting that the humility of God has necessary ongoing implications for the way in which we live and the way in which we try to shape church. And I'm going to be suggesting that God's humility and God's freedom are closely allied. So see if you agree with me, and if not, argue with Mark at the end. In this company, I'm sort of assuming you don't need me to defend the word humility. The sort of dictionary definitions of low self-regard and so on, I'd like to put that on one side. I'd like to come to a slightly more theological definition of humility. I'd also like you to banish from your minds Uriah Heep in David Copperfield, Dickens's great creepy villain, whose catchphrase is, "I'm ever so humble." Whereas actually, of course, what characterises Uriah Heep is a burning hatred of anyone who is better than himself. So he uses humility constantly to try and to show other people that they possess qualities and gifts and indeed material goods that they shouldn't have and he should. So now I've put that in your head, haven't I, when I'm saying take it out of your head. Take it out of your head, all right? In biblical terms, the word humble, when used about us, is often reminding us to see ourselves in our reality, to see how small and unimportant we are in relation to God, to take ourselves out of the centre of the universe where we naturally put ourselves. We naturally put ourselves in this place where everything revolves around us. And the word humility then is applied to believers in God, constantly reminding us that God is actually the centre of the universe, not us. And then I seem to be making my case harder then to apply this quality to God, because how is it possible to say then that God is the one who does not put himself at the centre of the universe, except that that is what we see. God is the one who is the centre of the universe and does not put himself at the centre of the universe. I'm going to be using masculine pronouns from time to time because it's simpler, but again, please be aware that God is not male. So I'm going to be arguing that God sees God's self truly, that quality of humility, to see ourselves truly, but also that God does not require constantly to be put at the centre of things. That God in Christ lives on the periphery of the great Roman Empire, that he interacts with people of no importance, that he does not constantly draw attention to himself. And I'm going to be arguing that God does not require affirmation. It may look as though that's what we're doing when we worship God. We're telling God how great he is, as though God needs that from us. But actually all Christian definitions of worship are about the worshipper. Worship is not good for God, worship is good for us. God can cope quite well without our worship. We can't cope so well without worshipping God. And so when I was writing the Lent book, the place I started was with St. Augustine in the 4th century, the great North African Bishop of Hippo, who tells his autobiography, his theological autobiography in that great work, The Confessions, which was not long ago, the Church Times did a most influential Christian books of all time kind of poll, one of those intriguing kind of polls that come out from time to time, and Augustine's Confessions, I think, came out first, maybe after the Bible. I think we ruled the Bible out and thought Augustine's Confessions comes very close to one of the most influential books in Christian history. So if you haven't read it, put it on your reading list, okay? And my suggestion is that you go first of all for the story. There are long passages of really intriguing theological musing, for example, about the problem of evil. But go first for the story and then come back to the theology. And one of the things that Augustine tells us is that throughout his search for a meaningful way of living in the world, the thing that he did not find, that he encountered when he finally gave in to belief in Jesus Christ, the thing that he didn't find anywhere else, was the humble God. You roughly know the story of Augustine, a highly intelligent, deeply arrogant young man. He describes himself like that, somebody who definitely did want to be at the centre of the universe, somebody who definitely did want everybody to see how wonderful he was, and clearly he was rather wonderful. He had a lot of lifelong friends and influenced them, so when he became a Manichaean, his friends all became Manichaeans. When he became a Christian, his friends all became Christians. So obviously a really engaging character. And one of the threads of Augustine's spiritual autobiography is searching for a way of living in the world that basically allows Augustine to go on thinking well of himself. And I think he's fairly honest about this. He'd like a kind of spirituality, a kind of understanding of the divine that enables him to go on doing what he wants to do and feel justified about it. So to begin with, he embraces a kind of Gnostic religion, which allows him to believe that the bad things that he longs to do are simply affecting his physical being, and they're about the internal battle between good and evil, between spiritual and physical. But the more he encounters himself, the more truthfully he looks at himself, the more he knows he's telling himself lies about that. And so that one of the great conversion stories in Christian history, Augustine, at the end of his tether, clearly close to a nervous breakdown, sitting in a garden somewhere in Italy, weeping, and he hears children's voices. He thinks it's children's voices in the garden next door, playing some kind of a game which he doesn't recognise, and the words of the game are pick it up and read it, pick it up and read it. And he looks down and there's St. Paul's epistles sitting on the grass beside him, and he picks it up and reads it, and God, through the scriptures, turns Augustine's life around. I've always thought that it shows something of God's humour, that this highly arrogant young man, who really, he talks about the pupils that he had to teach with such dismissive, he really thought they were remarkably stupid, most of the boys he had to teach. Well, they possibly were, but there's no need to describe that for centuries to come, is there? That it's the voices of children that God uses to reach out to Augustine. And this is what Augustine actually writes. This is from Henry Chadwick's translation of the Confessions. To possess my God, the humble Jesus, I was not yet humble enough. I did not know what his weakness was meant to teach. In the inferior parts, he built for himself a humble house of our clay. By this, he detaches from themselves those who are willing to be made his subjects and carries them across to himself. They are no longer to place confidence in themselves, but rather to become weak. They see at their feet divinity become weak. In their weariness, they fall prostrate before this divine weakness, which rises up and lifts them up. So Augustine's insight is that trying to place confidence in yourself is ultimately exhausting. Can you hear that thread of exhaustion, of constantly having to battle to be top dog? That was Augustine's own experience. And what Augustine notices is that God doesn't do that. The God he encounters in Jesus Christ is not interested in that faintly. That the God Augustine encounters in Jesus Christ is the humble God who waits at our feet, wearing our clay, becoming human like us, until we finally admit that we are defeated and allow God to raise us up. And clearly what Augustine is talking about is Christology. He's talking about the coming of Jesus Christ. Augustine is talking then about the God who comes to become human like us. And that sense of God's humility is one that in my book I do trace throughout Jesus' earthly life. And it becomes more striking the more you look at it. I mean, we all know the story. You do. This isn't a spoiler, is it? You know what happens at the beginning and end of Jesus. Yes? Roughly familiar with the story. Excellent. But if you notice the point that the Gospels make about Jesus' birth into obscurity, Luke in particular makes it quite strikingly, because Luke gives us that great contrast between the action coerced by the Roman emperor, deciding to have a counting of his people, and it looks as though it's that census that is making all the peoples move around. It's that census that is driving Mary and Joseph to the point where Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and then gently Luke points out that this birth in Bethlehem fulfills the gentle action of God throughout the centuries, so that there's scriptural references that point to the fact that this is how it will happen. And God does nothing to force that. It looks as though all the force is being exercised by the Emperor Augustus, and yet what happens is God's outcome. The Emperor Augustus there's an inscription to him that describes him as the saviour of the world. And I suspect that a lot of Luke's early readers would have known that. So Luke is deliberately contrasting these two understandings of how we set about saving the world. One is the way in which the Roman Empire does it, by brutality and enforcing uniformity. And the other is this completely countercultural way in which God comes to live with us. And so this sense of God all the time working unseen, not demanding attention. It is perfectly possible most of the peoples looking at what was going on at that time didn't notice that actually the action of the world was figuring around the birth of this baby in a stable somewhere. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem of Judea without God having to force it to happen, apparently, without God using might to make it happen. Notice that Jesus' earthly life is spent largely among peasants. Again, if you read some of Richard Baucham's really interesting geographical studies of the Gospels, he does quite a lot of work on the physical settings of the Gospels. It looks as though most of the time Jesus is deliberately avoiding the centres of power, deliberately avoiding the place where he might interact with the courts of that age, deliberately avoiding the most influential people, and that might be partly to keep himself safe, but it also does seem to be some suggestion of where God's interests actually lie, interacting with peasants, paying attention to women and children. All the Gospels notice this weirdness of Jesus, is that he's interested in poor people, that he's interested in unimportant people. They also, chillingly, because we would prefer this not to be true, on several occasions say that one of Jesus' mantras was, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. He doesn't mean that, surely. Can't mean that. And then, of course, Jesus does not defend himself against the unjust accusations made against him, the unjust judgment that brings him to his death. A largely failed life, which should have vanished into obscurity. Even when Jesus is raised from the dead, this extraordinarily powerful miracle that we're told about, nonetheless, most people don't know it. Only those people who already had encountered Jesus met the risen Jesus, and their testimony is not always believed. So it is perfectly possible, in case you hadn't noticed, in the world that we're actually in, for Jesus Christ to be raised from the dead, and most people not know that. This mighty act of God's life and purpose, perfectly possible for people to go on doubting it, as with Jesus' miracles, as with the actions of God in the Hebrew Scriptures. God brings his people dry shod through the Red Sea that the narrative tells us, and yet within a few days, those same people are complaining. So it looks as though God is perfectly willing to be ignored, that he's perfectly willing to leave himself open to us to take him seriously or not to take him seriously. And it's resurrection, Easter, ascension in particular, the doctrine of the ascension, a much neglected doctrine, that gives us reason to say that this humility that we see operating in Jesus, in the earthly life of Jesus, is not something that's just limited to the incarnation, but is actually an aspect of how God operates in God's self, in God's reality. Because the ascension raises the story of Jesus Christ into the story that must be told about God. Wherever we tell about God as Christians, we tell this story of Jesus Christ, the non-negotiable telling of the nature of God. So it's not something that is that Jesus leaves behind, this humility, in order to go back to the splendours of heaven, but it is who God is. That famous dictum of Michael Ramsey's, God is Christ-like, and in him there is no un-Christ-likeness at all. Again, something that we need to take more deeply into ourselves. And this discovery is one that goes on being made throughout the centuries by some of my favourite theologians. Here's a little bit of Karl Barth, for example. God shows himself to be the great and true God in the fact that he can and will let his grace bear this cost, that he is capable and willing and ready for this. In their otherworldliness and supernaturalness and otherness, the gods, lowercase gods, are a reflection of human pride, which will not unbend. God is not proud. So that's exactly the same discovery that Augustine makes, that this is actually God's power. God has the power to be with us in God's humility in a way that other kinds of religious traditions don't talk about. Bonhoeffer's great insight in Letters and Papers from Prison and in other places about the God who allows himself to be pushed out of the world, the God who allows us to realise that religion is a way of requiring God to act on our behalf rather than a way of God calling us to act as God acts. Would you like a bit of Bonhoeffer? How much of this shall I give you? This is the decisive difference between Christianity and all religions. Man's religiosity makes him look in his distress to the power of God in the world. He uses God as a deus ex machina. The Bible, however, directs us to the powerlessness and suffering of God. Only a suffering God can help. I'd love you to hang on to that phrase, only a suffering God can help, and see if we can come back to that and see if we actually can understand what it is that Bonhoeffer's talking about. To this extent, we may say that the process we've described by which the world came of age was an abandonment of the false conception of God and a clearing of the decks for the God of the Bible, who conquers power and space in the world by his weakness. Humans are challenged to participate in the sufferings of God at the hands of a godless world. One must therefore plunge oneself into the life of a godless world without attempting to gloss over its ungodliness with a veneer of religion or trying to transform it. To be a Christian does not mean to be religious in a particular way, to cultivate some particular form of asceticism, but to be a human being. A Christian participates in the suffering of God in the life of the world. So again, you can see that for Bonhoeffer, the character of God has instant implications for how we live our lives. If this is how God is, then we have to act accordingly. And writing from prison, we always have to look at the context of this. You can see why this becomes so absolutely fundamental to Bonhoeffer. He threw his hand in something to try and change the world, and that utterly, apparently failed. The outcome of Bonhoeffer's life is to be executed just before the end of the war. That really painful piece of irony, and yet hugely influential at the same time. I could go on reading you bits from my favourite theologians. I'm in the middle of trying to work my way through Catherine Sonderegger's systematic theology. I recommend that. I'm not at all sure that I've entirely understood it, but she takes some of the great traditional ways of describing the character of God, like his omnipresence and his omnipotence, and looks at those as moral qualities. She describes God's omnipresence as invisibility. So God is everywhere, and yet it is perfectly possible not to notice that. And she describes God's omnipotence as a moral doctrine, which is goodness, with a very interesting and challenging discussion of whether humility then redefines power to such an extent that God is actually powerless. And that's one of the questions I'd love us to come back with. Are we actually, if we're saying that God is humble, are we actually saying that God is without power in our universe? She does some really interesting examination of some of the theologians that she describes as kenotic theologians. Happy with that word, kenotic? God's self-emptying. And who put the emphasis on the fact that God's humility on the cross overwhelms other powers and relentlessly faces humanity with love and forgiveness that cannot be destroyed. And that is a kind of power. You can see that that's what Bonhoeffer is talking about. But does it actually mean that all that God can do is be reactive, that God simply has to wait for us to respond? And Sonderegger wants to explore the idea of God's humble, omnipotent vitality. She talks about God's power as life, power as relation, so that nothing can ever stop God from being our God, God for us. God is always the one who recreates relationships, and it is the source of all life and light. I won't read you the long passage now, but if you want to have a look at it, it's in so far we've only had volume 1 of her systematic theology, looking at God's omnipotence as a moral doctrine. So I think what I'm suggesting is that if we take this trajectory from the incarnation to be a true insight into the character of God, and therefore to have implications for the way in which we live, it centres around the fact that God doesn't need to be loved or needed. God is self-sufficient, and therefore God is able to be utterly humble because God doesn't need anything from us. God is able simply to be available to us, to offer God's self, God's presence, God's life, constant forgiveness, constant recreation of relationship, because God isn't hurt and offended by us. God is not in need of anything that we have to offer, and nothing that we can do to God makes God cease to be God. There's absolutely nothing that we do that can make God less God. And God, as shown in Jesus Christ, is loving, merciful, and present with us. So there's a kind of inexorable quality that is described. This is one of my favourite novels. I read it every few years. It's called A Man on a Donkey, The Man on a Donkey. And it's about the pilgrimage of grace, the great Catholic pilgrimage that tried to persuade Henry VIII not to break with the Church in Rome. For anybody from a Protestant tradition, it's really humbling reading, and therefore good for us. And one of the characters in it is a Protestant, a reforming priest called Gib Dor, who's actually a really horrible character. And the trouble is, he knows he's horrible. He loves the Word of God, and he loves to preach it, and he cannot make it have any effect on his life whatsoever. So this is Gib at the end of the story, running away. It was a cheerless evening, and the sun set forlornly in a haze of chill yet tarnished light. Gib hung his head down as he went, and would neither speak nor look up, so beaten to the ground was he by shame, while his soul chewed upon something compared with the bitterness of which the salt smart of penitence would have been sweet as honey. For now he knew that though God might save every other man, Gib Dor he could not save. Once he had seen his sin as a thing that clung close as his shadow clung to his heels. Now he knew it was the very stuff of his soul. Never could he, a leaking bucket, not to be mended, retain God's saving grace, however freely outpoured. Never could he, that heavy lump of sin, do any other than sink and sink again, however often Christ walking on the waves should stretch his hand to lift and bring him safe. He did not know that though the bucket be leaky, it matters not at all when it's deep in the deep sea, and the water both without it and within. He did not know, because he was too proud to know, that a man must endure to sink and sink again, but always crying upon God, never for shame ceasing to cry, until the day when he shall find himself lifted by the bland swell of that power, inward, secret, as little to be known as to be doubted, the power of omnipotent grace in tranquil, irresistible operation. Beautiful, isn't it? And it's describing the kind of humble power that Augustine is talking about, that we see operating in Jesus Christ. And interestingly, that irresistible, tranquil power that is perfectly possible to ignore, and that Gibb does ignore, because Gibb is still the centre of his universe. He may hate himself, but that's a kind of inverted pride in a way. He thinks he's too awful to be saved. He has made his self-hatred into a kind of terrible pride that resists this gentle and irresistible humility of God. So I think what I'm suggesting is that there are fundamental consequences to this picture of the humble God, if that is a good description of God, and that we misunderstand values and purposes in deeply damaging ways, that we constantly choose to put ourselves at the centre of the universe rather than to put ourselves as part of this big story of the nature of God. And it affects how we see each other, how we value people, with such different kinds of value from the kind of value God gives them. God in Christ chooses relationships particularly with the humble, perhaps because need enhances dependence. These are people who are willing to acknowledge their dependency and therefore willing to enter into relationship. We have persuaded ourselves, most of us, that we have the ability to live autonomously and choose who we relate to and how much we relate. And we don't choose to see that this is a symptom of a fallen world, a symptom of something that takes us away from the character of God. So in the book I look at, for example, the L'Arche community and the values that come out of a community of interdependence like that, where the so-called able-bodied actually find that they're learning about the character of God from people who know dependence is an inevitable part of who they are. And we look again at the description that Jesus gives of the command that Jesus gives us to love our enemies, love, the great commandment, a willingness to put ourselves in relationship and dependence upon each other. So what might it be like to believe that this is the character of God, therefore the character of the universe, therefore the character of heaven, the place where we hope we are heading, and how might what kind of Christian disciplines might actually help us to practice this kind of humility that, if I'm right, is the freedom of God. God is always able to be God's self because God doesn't mind whether we like him or not. What might it be like to have that kind of freedom in relation to others? What might it be like to want to give rather than receive attention? What might it be like to try to imitate that wholeness, that integrity that we see in God? I keep saying God can never be made to be anything other than God. What would it be like if we could truly say that nothing could make us not be Christians? Under no circumstances would we act in ways that we are later ashamed of. Well, that's not going to happen this side of heaven, but what are the disciplines that might make us more able to work in that kind of direction? And not be thrown about by waves of different, the kind of things that act upon us, but like God, to act out of that freedom, that we know who we are and we don't need to be the centre of attention. So the character of God and our Christian discipleship, one of the themes that I hope came out of that. The power of God, have I defined power in a way that actually makes it powerlessness? I'd love you to think about that. And all kinds of other questions that I won't have thought of. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jane. Thanks very much for being with us. I think we have some time for some
Sorry, that was
Q&A.
a bit longer than I should.
No, that's great. That's great. Let's we'll just pull up two chairs up here real quick.
I thought I didn't have enough to last for half an hour, but once I start reading A Man on a Donkey, it goes on.
Get you up here. Oh, you've come and grab a seat.
Thank you.
We've got a bit of time before lunch. I think you've
Lunch is the important thing.
you have opened up so many questions, and I know that there will be a lot of questions from everybody out there. But I'd love to kick us off. Yeah, there we go.
Perfect.
But
Thank you.
I'd love to. Oh, I'll give them back to you. I'd love to kick us off with one question that was kind of churning in my mind as you were speaking, and this comes a bit because I was just preaching recently on Philippians 2 and the humility and suffering of Christ, and I wondered, and I've still been wondering. I'm sure that we'll have questions about the kind of doctrinal implications, but I suppose on a more human level, what do you see in kind of Paul's theology of following Christ on this downward path and suffering on his behalf in this world? I mean, it struck me that there are two kinds of suffering. It seems like he's referring to one is the suffering of believing in the truth and living that out, and suffering at the hands of those opposition to those forces that stand against God's sovereignty. But then it seems that there's also that suffering that you get out of a place like L'Arche and Jean Vanier, that inward suffering, that suffering on behalf of another person. And so I guess this is a bit of a two-part question. So I guess how do you perceive Paul tying in kind of the Christian's experience of suffering to be kind of this unifying experience with Christ? And then the second part is just on a practical level, how do we, who are caught up in the realms of academic theology in a very, sometimes very comfortable life, how then do we think about participating in that kind of suffering?
It's interesting because you've just made a sort of light bulb moment for me, connecting Paul's theology with what Bonhoeffer was saying about throwing yourself into the reality of the world. And I think one of the things two things that I notice about Paul, one is that as he describes himself before conversion, he was a very angry and a very angry young man, not really at home with himself. And the Paul that we meet in the epistles, he's not an emollient character, is he? He's not somebody that you necessarily want to spend the rest of your days talking to. But you can see him coming to a real sense of self-knowledge, so that actually submitting himself to Jesus Christ seems to be increasingly setting himself free. And I think watching that sort of spiritual journey, which obviously Paul doesn't write his own confessions, so we don't see quite what's going on there, but it is nonetheless intriguing. But also, I think those earliest Christians had, in a way, a blessing that we don't have, but that many of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world have, which is that they had no illusion that they could change the systems of government or impose Christianity on anybody else. So they simply had to live out their own discipleship in relation. It's one of the things that you notice in all the epistles is they're always talking about this new community, which is a third way of being. It's not Jew or Gentile, it's something new. And so I tend to think that the community is one of the things, again, that we need to pay more attention to. Why is the church the result of the resurrection? Why is that what God brings into being when God's Son is raised from death to life? Us. We don't look like the obvious response to that, and yet we're told that we're the beginning of the new creation. And so I think those two, our own discipleship and Paul's insights into suffering, do sort of hang together. I'm rambling, but one of those really influential books that hardly anybody's read is a book by John Zizulis called Being as Communion, And his definition of sin, of the original fall, is that human beings choose being over communion. They choose self-definition over taking their definition from God. And the church is if that's an interesting way of describing sinfulness, which I think it is, then the church in a sense is trying to help us reverse that. It's trying to help us choose communion over being. It's trying to help us define ourselves primarily as we give ourselves to each other, rather than how we see ourselves independently. And I think that's a Christian discipline. What would it be like to genuinely receive yourself and give yourself to others, even not chosen others? Yeah. Sorry, that is a long and rambling answer.
Thank you. Matthias has the microphone. Does anybody else have any, would like to kick off with some more questions?
Particularly to Mark, he would love to answer a lot of questions.
Definitely. I know Matthias has several questions, so you might have to start us jotting down notes. Becky.
Thank you so much. Just one question. It might be because I've misunderstood something, but I wonder about the pastoral applications of humility and how you would apply that to situations where somebody's being abused, or how do you carry on being in a situation where you let people do things to you and you don't have any power in that situation? How do you apply that pastorally to that sort of situation? Does that make sense?
Yes, that's a hugely important question. And again, if you watch Jesus, he's not a pushover. He's not a doormat. He doesn't allow himself to be captured until the time is right. He's not afraid of standing up for himself. He's not afraid of correcting other people. So this humility is not a sort of passivity, which is why I would love to connect it with freedom. And I think in that kind of pastoral situation, what you're looking for as the ultimate goal, which may take years and maybe not this side of heaven, what you're looking for is to free people from the kind of oppression of them that has been put on them by others. What would it be like to truly be able to say, I will not be defined in the way that you're defining me by that abuse and that treatment. I am who I am in my relationship with God, not who you say I am. And so I think that freedom genuinely to be yourself might be part of a pastoral answer to that. But you're absolutely right that humility mustn't be, and as it has been, particularly for women, being used as you have to put up with whatever people choose to do to you. That's abuse, that's not humility, but it's a really important question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm not a theological scholar, so I might be missing some of your categories, but I'm just wondering how you might think about the difference, or if there is a difference between this abstract idea of suffering that as Christians partaking in communion with the Lord, there's a sort of suffering in that path towards the new heavens and the new earth. And that distinction between the particular suffering of actual people in particular places on this earth at this very moment, and the ways in which Jesus was aligning himself with very particular people in their suffering, and then through his own suffering on the cross, and that how do Christians sort of walk this line between kind of a suffering by just a reality of walking after Christ, or how much do we need to look towards aligning ourselves with the very particular suffering of people in particular places that will force us to uncomfortably look beyond what is just visible to us in a place like the middle of Cambridge?
Again, a really important question. There's a way of talking about suffering that is entirely abstract. And which is why, again, I think it helps to look at Jesus. I can't think of anywhere in the Gospels where Jesus sees somebody suffering and says, I'm so sorry, but it'll do you good. As far as I can see, Jesus always confronts suffering, including his own. What we see on the cross is God's confrontation with the reality of suffering. And therefore, in my theology, suffering is not an eternal thing. It's not part of the nature and final purposes of God. And that therefore those of us called to try to be more and more Christ-like are also called to confront suffering. And in Cambridge, that means noticing the people who are on the margins, as well as being involved in some of the big struggles against poverty and endemic suffering. I think we as Christians should feel indignation at those marks of things that are so clearly out of sync with the reality that we feel called to live towards. And I think it doesn't require us to go out and attempt to flagellate ourselves so that we also suffer. I can't see that that's going to help anybody. But I think it does require us to assume that God might be more interested in the homeless person in the doorway than in those of us gathered in this church. We may think of ourselves as the people of God, but if you watch the action of Jesus, the people that Jesus is interested in are not the ones who are safely gathered in, but the ones on the margin. So there is quite enough suffering to be going on within Cambridge itself that we are, I think, required to pay attention to in ways that change how we act. Unfortunately, the first should be last and the last should be first.
Other questions? Matthias, you want to jump in?
Sure. Could I just add or follow on to your previous answer? A doctrinal question. If we talk about suffering, and if we talk about, you said at the beginning of your talk that the incarnation or Christ gives us a glimpse into the nature of God. And if we talk about humility and use the word powerlessness a lot, if we could sort of say that in Christ God limits himself to a certain extent, in what way, if Christ gives us a glimpse into the nature of God, in what way can we say that there is sort of a suffering in God, which you a few times said that obviously God in itself is not suffering, but how can we talk about that rather difficult question?
The question I was just talking with St. Melita students about on Monday. So we were looking at the doctrine of the atonement, and I asked the class to put up their hands if they think God suffers. And I think probably 90% of the class put up their hands, and we're a bit taken aback when I told them they're all heretics. And that is the new orthodoxy, probably compounded by the really moving and powerful rhetoric of people like Bonhoeffer and Moltmann, which assumes that if you don't suffer, you can't love. That love involves vulnerability. So I just pointed them towards a couple of good places to look at why the tradition has generally, the 2,000-year-old tradition of the church has generally resisted that simplistic slide from what it is for us to what it must be in God's self. And one of the sort of really simple responses is that as far as we know, God doesn't have a beard and 10 toes and a penis. The sort of physical characteristics of the earthly Jesus. Suffering and death are physical characteristics. So for Jesus to be, for the second person of the Trinity to become fully human is to take on those human characteristics. But that does not mean that those characteristics become eternally part of God any more than any other physical characteristics. Anybody who wants to pursue that line of thinking, try Thomas Aquinas, or a book by Thomas Weinandy called Does God Suffer, which simply puts the more traditional perspective on that. I think with Catherine Sonderegger, I would like us to see that what goes on in Jesus is that real engagement with the reality of humanity. When Andy's phrase is something like, in the incarnation, God does nothing as God in the incarnation. Because God doesn't need to do anything as God. God is fully present as God already. In the incarnation, what is happening is a human being fully obedient to God. So what we're seeing in Jesus is always the human cooperation with God. And in this world that involves suffering, but what we see then is God's unquenchable life that is able to, even through death, hold on to the reality of that relationship between Father and Son. Does that make sense? And even if not, try Thomas Wynandy, okay? You don't have to believe that, because as I say, there are now a large number of theologians who would want to say that that importantly God does suffer, but I'm just not one of them. So
it's just interesting because I think what then will you do with passages in the Old Testament? Thinking of Hosea and 1 Samuel 8 and the rejection of God as their king, and again that humility and that sovereignty, but yet allowing Israel to reject God and to reject His covenant over them, and that tornness in Hosea of do I destroy you or do I not destroy you? So certainly there's an anthropomorphism of suffering in the Old Testament of kind of the divine God. Do you see that as God's experience of suffering in kind of His triuneness? How do you...
Well, you're the Old Testament scholar, Mark.
But I would say that God suffers in the Old Testament, so I'm on the heretical side.
Are you? Oh, interesting. I shall have to do something about that in the years to come. I think the Bible absolutely requires us to see the validity of anthropomorphic language about God, and in pastoral situations. The cross is just so hugely important, isn't it, to be able to say that God doesn't sit outside suffering and knows nothing about it and doesn't care about it, and that God in Christ has made a way to be present with us in suffering and even into death, so that when we go into death, we know that the Son of God has walked that path before us. There is a way through it, because God has forged that way for us. That's all hugely important, but I don't think that... I think we just need to be a little bit careful and put imaginative and linguistic brackets around when we're talking about the experience of God. Because what we're always doing is extrapolating from our experience to the experience of God. And that it has some justifications. Again, Aquinas will tell you all about analogical language. But it also reminds us about the limits of our imaginations.
Do we have time for one more question?
I think we got time for one more before lunch.
Hi, so I just wanted to sort of, this returns a little bit to some of the earlier questions, but I'm not from Cambridge, I don't live here, I'm just visiting, and I work in a sort of parish church in Nottingham, and in the course of my work I come across a lot of people who are very marginalised and really struggling, long-term mental health problems, homelessness and all that kind of stuff. And you said earlier we should encourage people to kind of learn to be themselves. And I wondered, for people who are the most oppressed and the most marginalised and who are kind of slipping through the cracks of society, and who are just subject to, at the mercy of all these kind of systems that don't work for them, what does it mean for people like that to be themselves?
Again, that's just such an important question, isn't it? And I want to give such a long and complicated answer that it's going to take 100 years or so. I want, again, to start with the story that we as Christians are required to tell is a particular story. God becomes incarnate in this one particular person at a particular time who interacts with particular people. And God's interest in particularity, I think, is quite striking. God doesn't deal with human beings in general. God deals with individual human beings. And the story of this person that you're talking about is a story indelibly shaped by the life that she has had to live through a combination of choice and complete lack of choice. And so what is it like for us to believe that this is the person that God is dealing with, that God isn't going to wait till she's somebody else, but that as she is, in the reality of who she is now and is becoming, she is beloved? What might it be like to attempt to react to her like that? And obviously hope that in various ways one can ameliorate things, but actually not wait until they're better before she is beloved and worthy of attention. What is this story that we tell ourselves of the crucified human being whose face will be the face of our judge? What is it like then for people who have lived on the margins of things, been absolutely... what is it like for them to know that this is the person who is judging the earth, not the rich and the powerful, but the unjustly accused and the outcast? And then the next sort of 100 years worth of answer is to suggest you read some of the writings of the theologian Frances Young, who has a deeply disabled son called Arthur, and she's written a lot about theology from Arthur's perspective. And she talks about, sorry, I'm going to cry, about how well-meaning Christian friends have often told her that in heaven Arthur will be perfect, by which they mean, of course, not disabled. And she's trying to get her head round, how can that be? Because this is the life Arthur has actually lived. If he's perfect in heaven, he's not Arthur. How can God take the particularity of Arthur and make it transcendently full of love and promise? And so I find her one of the most challenging theologians with exactly those kind of questions that you're asking, which are fundamental Christian questions, I think, if Jesus really is our insight into God, the story that we have to tell the world. So not an answer, but some ways that you might like to continue to explore that.
Jane, thank you so much. Can we thank Jane once again? If you are interested in this topic, I do highly recommend her book, Merciful Humility of God. Do go buy your copy, in The Art of Advent. So it is wonderful. It's a great Advent devotional. I'll say it again because I really loved it. I might use it myself again this year.